Welcome to the 12th episode of Second Mind Medicine. I'm Anoop Kumar, and today we're going to be taking a preliminary look at deriving healing systems, right? So, how healing systems approach the human being, right? And how we come up with the classifications that we do for the human being. So, as always, just send me a message, let me know if the audio and video are coming through clearly. And as people jump on, we'll spend a few minutes together in silence. Taking full and easy breaths. And allowing the mind to settle. And recognizing the distinction or non-distinction, as it may be, between what we call a body and what we call mind. Are these two things? All right. So can you hear me okay? All right, let me know if it's coming through okay. So the last couple weeks I was out of town, and so some people are asking how come the last couple sessions were not live. Okay, great. Looks like everything's coming through. So let's just take a few minutes to talk about deriving healing systems. So, what is a healing system, first of all? So, in this book, in Michelangelo's Medicine, this is the first book I had written. What I did was many of the terms I used in this book I underlined because many times we use words without paying attention to what they're actually describing and the lines of thinking down which they lead us, right? So for example, when we say healthcare, it's a word that everybody uses, but what does it really mean? And the way we use it indicates what things about our culture and the way we approach things, right? So these questions start to come up, and that's important to look at if we want to look at things deeply. So one word that I felt was missing, I could keep saying medicine or I could keep saying healthcare, but one phrase that I felt was missing is healing system, because there are all kinds of approaches to healing and different people have different ideas and each one develops a kind of system. So a healing system in this case is a unique system of diagnosis and healing that understands and engages the many dimensions of a person's well-being. Healing systems are influenced by the culture in which they develop and reflect different perspectives on human anatomy and physiology. Right? So simply, rather than saying healthcare, when we say healing system, we should understand that it's a unique way of diagnosing and healing, and it's unique to how we see a human being and the culture in which we see, right? The culture shapes how we see and what we think. So when we're talking about deriving healing systems, as we are, so this was the book. People are asking which book. This is the book, Michelangelo's Medicine. The title came because I was inspired to write a lot of it when I was in Florence once, and I was inspired by Michelangelo's statue of David. But coming back to this, when we talk about deriving healing systems, they always come from a point of view. And that's what I want to focus on today. All right. So let's look at 3 healing systems, for example. One would be Ayurveda, which is the healing system of India. It's thousands of years old. One is traditional Chinese medicine, also thousands of years old, from China. And another is allopathy, which is our modern medicine. And the term allopathy is very controversial, or at least somewhat controversial, because people say, well, there's no such thing as allopathy. It's just medicine, or it's just science-based medicine, right? But in fact, we see that even science and even our approach to science is based in certain philosophical assumptions. And so what we want to do when using this term healing system is we want to contextualize our entire approach, where we're coming from, the assumptions, the philosophy, the culture, etc. And so when we want to look from a healing system perspective, we do need some kind of term. So it can be some other term, whichever you prefer, but allopathy is what we're going to use for now to describe the prevalent, what we call modern medicine system of diagnosis and treatment, right? The modern medical model. So let's take a look at each of these 3 in terms of how they derive their healing systems. So first, when we look at Ayurveda, we see that Ayurveda describes the human being as coming from 5 different elements, 5 fundamental elements, right? The common ones, if you know Ayurveda, the common way of categorizing or classifying the human being is according to 3 tendencies or 3 behaviors or 3 ways, 3 expressions, and that's Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, right? We don't have to go into details of what these mean or what they signify. It's just important to understand that the 3 main ways of categorizing the human being, approaching the human being in Ayurveda, is through Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. And those 3 come from the 5 elements. They're different combinations of the basic 5 elements, right? Which are space, air, fire, water, and earth, right? So why is this important? Because the origin of all this, right, that Ayurveda follows is the traditional philosophies, right? The ancient Indian philosophies, such as, for example, Sankhya philosophy, right? And in Sankhya philosophy, what we say is that there is what is fundamental and how things appear is through consciousness and matter, right? Or Purusha and Prakriti, right? Or consciousness and energy, Purusha and Prakriti. Anyway, these 2 classifications, right? And both of these are fundamental to the world. And the world we see is some kind of expression and combination of these 2. This is the underlying philosophy, or one of the underlying philosophies of Ayurveda, right? Why is this important? Because anytime we approach a person to see what's happening, right, what we call diagnosis, or anytime we do anything for that matter, the first thing we have to describe if we're teaching or learning is what is our canvas, right? What is the fundamental place that we are starting from? And in the case of Ayurveda, although we can say it's these 5 elements, even these 5 elements are explicitly couched within subtler philosophies. And so fundamental to Ayurveda is the recognition of consciousness and matter, right? This is explicitly imbued through all of Ayurveda. In some type of relationship, we know that there is consciousness and it is fundamental and it is influential, and we know that there is matter, right? And in Chinese medicine, we have the philosophy of yin and yang, right? The yin and yang, which is similar to the complementarity of today, which is similar to, or at least in terms of its complementarity, similar to Purusha and Prakriti. There is this fundamental idea of balance, that these two, this give and take, this push and pull, is fundamental to understanding any activity that's going on, including in the case of medicine, the human being, right? And when we look at allopathy, what we see is that the fundamental way that we look at the human being starts with physical anatomy, right? If you look at the canvas of allopathy, it's based on physical anatomy, right? It's based on the limbs, the torso, the head and neck, the abdomen, the pelvis, right? This physical structure is basically our map of the human being. So in allopathy, there is no, when you learn medicine, when we learn allopathic medicine, there's no explicit statement about the role of mind or even the existence of mind or consciousness or how consciousness and matter interact or how mind and body interact. None of this is part of the foundational aspect of allopathy. And so the philosophy that allopathy subscribes to is essentially mind-body dualism, right? Now, we could say that Sankhya philosophy is also mind-body dualism because it says Purusha and Prakriti, right? There's consciousness and there's matter, for example, right? There's consciousness and there's expression as matter or as energy. However, the big difference is that it's very explicit in Ayurveda, right? It's this dualism is explicit also. This complementarity is explicit in traditional Chinese medicine. In allopathy, it's not explicit. And therefore, that's why now there's so much talk about integrative medicine. There's talk about mind-body medicine, and all of these terms are there. You won't see this in the other systems because right from the beginning, on the canvas of the human being, consciousness or mind is directly on the canvas to begin with, right? So when we talk about anatomy in allopathy, what we're talking about is physical anatomy, and that mind part has been left out. So the map of what we are dealing with, right? To even say human being is already taking a couple steps forward, a couple steps beyond. To back up a couple steps, the map of what we are dealing with when we're talking about a healing system determines where we start. And in the case of allopathy, we start much further down the line in the sense that we're not taking into account how something emerges, whether there is complementarity, right? We have this idea, it's there in our language, for example, positive and negative, right? We know on a circuit, on a battery circuit, electrons flow from the positive side to the negative side of a circuit, right? So we can say that the negative side, negative, I put in quotes, it's not the connotation of negative, but the denotation. It's just two polarities. It has nothing to do with good or bad here, right? But the negative side is the receiver, right? It receives electrons, it receives a charge, and so we can say that the negative side as being receiving or being feminine, and the positive side as being giving or directional, and that being masculine. So we can see that there is some kind of polarity, some kind of complementarity there, but this is not part of the philosophy of allopathy, right? If we start digging and we can kind of come up with these speculations, but ultimately the practice of allopathy, the study of allopathy begins with understanding the canvas, which is the physical structure, which is how we represent the human being. So allopathy starts further down the line, having assumed mind-body dualism, and pretty much, at least by default, ignoring the mind in a formal way. In a systematic way, the mind is essentially ignored, right? And then subsequent to that, we develop the body, and then the idea comes that the mind is created by the body, which is the philosophy of materialism, and on down the road, right? So this is the allopathic system, and in contrast, you can see that of traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurveda is based on the subtler system, which starts to incorporate both mind and body right from the beginning. So this is important to see because each will have its strengths. Whatever we focus on, we become experts on, right? So as we focus on the body, we can become experts on that. As we focus on the intersection of mind and body, we become experts on that. As we focus simply on consciousness, that becomes the expertise. So when we look at it this way, this is all within the broader rubric of what I'm calling second mind medicine, right? So second mind medicine is basically starting with the primacy of consciousness and seeing this consciousness as a kind of supersaturated solution, right? And just as in a supersaturated solution, there's no crystallized solute, but when you add just a little bit of solute, right, even that one idea, then the solute precipitates, right? The definite idea of what we're dealing with, the way that we're approaching starts to precipitate, starts to show up in the solution. Similarly, from this second mind, from this broader field of undifferentiated, non-local consciousness, right? When the first inkling of an approach precipitates, it is from that our entire approach to diagnosis, treatment, healing precipitates along with it. And each of these is a healing system, right? In the initial precipitation process, in the initial process of crystallizing our thoughts, our worldview, our assumptions, is the full picture included? Are we including consciousness along with matter? Or are we taking one road and then leading to another, coming back around and finding the first through that initial road? Right? These are different ways of approaching what we are, what the world is. Each is precipitated out of this second mind potential nature. So this is a broad look at how different healing systems, and this can of course be applied to anything, to the Thai system of anatomy and physiology, or to Reiki, or to strict physical anatomy and surgical anatomy, to histology, to anything, to psychology, right? The psychology is basically looking, it's the study of psyche is actually soul, but we refer to it as mind, right? It's the speech of the soul is psychology. Literally translated, psychology is the speech of the soul, right? So that too takes a particular form. If you look at the labels that we use, they too are derived based on a certain approach. So the degree to which this includes the idea of body, includes the idea of mind, focuses on one or the other, integrates these two, this kind of combining process, the unique blending process, is what leads to a unique healing system, all of which precipitate from this fundamental potential nature that is the second mind, right? So by recognizing this and by recognizing the ingredients that go to each healing system, we can see where we are and what matches up with that, right? And everything else comes into play there, right? What do the scientific studies show? What is our idea of science? What are the assumptions that go into the studies? What is working for me? Why is it working for me? Is it because of its initial approach, its initial assumptions, the initial approach or assumptions that I have, our core values, our worldview? Everything now is brought into play when we look at this from a second mind perspective. All right, let me try to. Let me know if there are any questions here. Lost connection. Okay, I hope you guys can hear me here. All right, great. All right, so we'll leave it here. If you have questions, just put them in the comments below and we'll take a look during the week. And I'll see you next week.